Welcome everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute or so.
I'm just going to shut my door. Just give me 2 seconds.
Great. Sure. And
excited to see everybody this week.
Yes.
I'm coming to you guys from a barn in Massachusetts, so it looks a little different for me this week. I don't have my books and my plants, my usual little Zoom setup.
Yeah. It's a pretty background though. I like the wood.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
And if you can all just say in the chat where you're calling in from today and maybe a word or two about how you're feeling. So it's just a nice way to get to know each other a little bit more. Okay. Well, I'm going to get things started, and I know that there's a bunch more people who will be joining us. But welcome to Holding Space with Claire Bidwell Smith and the co-founders of Being Here Human, Michelle and Rochelle. My name is Dara Kosberg, and I am the program director of Reimagine. As a nonprofit organization, we spark community conversations like this one that empower individuals, families, and communities to face the hardest parts of our existence, including serious illness and death, while inspiring people to celebrate life and one another. And before we get started, I just wanted to express our profound gratitude that we have sponsors such as these who support Reimagine and make this work all possible. And before we get started, I just want to review. These are my cats, Sammy and Biscuit, and they're telling us that if you'd like to, during the Q&A, you can turn on your mic to ask a question. We can call on you, and you can turn on and off your camera. I will say I think it's nice when people's cameras are on so that we can feel a little bit more connected. If you have any comments or questions, you can put them in the chat. And as I mentioned, after Claire's conversation, we will open it up to asking those questions. So please add them as we go. If you're finding the chat distracting, you can always close it by clicking that little arrow at the top and clicking close. Great. And I am going to introduce Claire, and she is an internationally renowned author, speaker, and grief expert. She's the author of 3 books of nonfiction, The Rules of Inheritance, After This, When Life is Over, Where Do We Go? And Anxiety, The Missing Stage of Grief. I highly recommend all of them. And with that, I'm going to give Claire the mic and stop our screen share.
Thank you so much, Dara. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm coming to you from a barn in Massachusetts today. So if you see me start dripping sweat, that's what's going on. But I'm excited to be here with all of you. This is really, really the favorite time of my week. I started these conversations as soon as the pandemic started, and I just really wanted to create some kind of space where people could come and hear thoughts and ideas and kind of advice and just feel not so alone during this time. And I've been bringing in people from the death and dying space and having these just incredible conversations every week. And I'm so grateful to Reimagine and Dara for helping organize this. And I'm really excited today to have Rochelle and Michelle from Being Here Human with us. I'm going to, rather than read a little bio about them, I'm going to have them tell you all about themselves. However you guys want to start, but I would love to have you share a little bit about your personal stories with everyone, how you got into this space, and then also how you created your incredible organization. Welcome.
Thank you, Claire.
Yeah.
I'll get started. So my name is Michelle Williams, and I am one of the co-founders of Being Here Human, a Toronto-based social enterprise where we focus on grief literacy and issues of grief and loss. Our focus and our orientation is very much coming from an anti-oppressive, non-pathology, anti-racist model. And then just to say a little bit about myself. So I am a trained social worker. I have a master's in social work, but about 10 years ago, I lost my mother to a rare form of cancer. She was relatively young at the time that she was diagnosed, and from diagnosis to her death, we had 10 months with her. And so that really prompted me to re-examine the work that I was doing, where I wanted to go with my life, as I think it does for many people who experience a significant loss. And so I pursued social work and went back for my master's. But during my education, I was confronted with the reality that I was realizing that the experience that I was having as a grieving person looked very different from many others. And even during the process of my mother dying, I noticed in my experiences working in end of life and palliative care that the experience that we had as a family didn't look like everyone else's experience. So coming from being a person of color and coming from a family of multi-ethnic backgrounds, I realized that we were having a very, very different experience from the dominant culture who I confronted in end of life and palliative care, which was predominantly white and Christian. I then met Rochelle, maybe 5 or 6 years ago now, and we made an instant connection, and we both realized that we were having a very similar observation of what we were seeing in end of life and palliative care, and also in terms of how folks were supported when they were bereaved and grieving. And through that experience, we came together and realized that we wanted to do something different. We wanted to sort of identify these unique experiences. We wanted to shine a light on the fact that not everyone is having the same end of life, same grief and loss, same bereaved experience. And we wanted to have an intention about the work that we were doing that very much centered the voices of folks who were most marginalized, while at the same time offering an orientation to grief and loss that sort of bucked the trend of pathologizing grief. And so that's a little bit about me and my story, and I'm gonna allow my co-founder, Rochelle, introduce herself.
Thank you.
Awesome. I'm Rochelle Ben-Soussan, the other half of Being Here Human. And I did not imagine this for my life whatsoever. From the time I was little, the only thing I ever loved to do and wanted to do was sing. And the dream that I had for myself was to be on Broadway, and nothing was going to deter me from it. And it was a very singular focus. And so,
amazing.
Yes. And then so I studied theater in my undergrad. I moved to England for a year to study vocal performance. I studied at Cap 21 at NYU. Like, it was just a straight road. And a very long story short, along the way, I met a stunning woman named Diane, my beloved, who was also a singer. She was a classical singer. She was in the Canadian Opera Company. She also was the understudy of Christine in Phantom of the Opera in Toronto. And when, I guess, 6 weeks after my 25th birthday, she died. And she died of stage 4 metastatic melanoma. And from the time she was diagnosed until the time she died was 6 months and 2 days. And so when she was ill, I moved in with her. She had 2 young kids. I helped take care of her kids. I was a primary caregiver. And at 24, it was the first time in my life I had seen illness up close, that I had seen deterioration and decay of that kind. Certainly my first experience with a dead body. And ironically, because of our culture's mythology around grief and the idea that you can only grieve if there's a dead body, and it was a person, and it was a person in this little circle of people, I found as a queer person that when she died, there wasn't a lot of room for my experience of loss. It wasn't a spouse, it wasn't a child, it wasn't a parent. And so, you know, it was the largest loss of my entire life, still is, and there wasn't a lot of space for it. Similar to that, I took her death, I mean, I think we all would have, but like, I took it so hard, and in a way that I remember saying to lots and lots of people in the early years, like, this feels so much bigger than just her. Like, she was amazing, but this actually does feel so much bigger. And of course now, 15 years later, having done this work for a long time, I can say it's because it was. And even though if you had asked me right then at 25, had I had any previous losses, I would have said no. What I can look on now with a much more literate lens, I can see that I lost both my parents at a very young age, not due to death, but due to mental illness and intergenerational trauma. And so I was raised by an aunt. I come from a long lineage of displacement and refugees and immigration. And so loss was everywhere in my life. I'd been orphaned from a very young age, but because there wasn't a body, I wouldn't have claimed that for myself. And so when Diane died, what happened, I often say like the levees broke, and then it was just a tsunami of grief. And for about 3 to 4 years, I just flailed. And there's no other kind of way to make that prettier. Like I flailed, I was so in it. And of course, when I was saying then, the only language I had was, this feels so much bigger than this. And of course I was mourning my whole life. And not having been parented and my parents and all of those things, but I didn't have the language for it at the time. So once she died, it made it really hard to sing, because in order to sing, you need to breathe. And every time I breathed, I cried. And so it really, put a dent in my auditions. Nobody wanted to hire the weeping singer. And so, I just flailed for years and years. I was trying to make my way back to North Africa, which is where I'm from. And on my journeys, I got sidetracked in Ghana, which is a country in West Africa. And I ended up spending quite a bit of time in a very small rural village called Agbazume, right along the Togolese border. And that was my first workshop on grief literacy, was living there. And my first schooling, and my first tiny little seed being planted of the idea that it can be done so radically differently from what I had experienced here. My experience here, and why I ended up leaving Canada to return to North Africa, was because everybody here, the moment, like I'm talking the moment she died, before she was even buried, I had people who deeply loved me, come up to me and say, "You must be so relieved. Now you can get back to your life in New York. You must be so happy. Now you can, move forward." And like all of the mirroring I was getting was so the antithesis of what my internal landscape was actually experiencing, that it was crazy making. I just felt like I was actually being gaslit everywhere I went. And what I learned in my time in Ghana, being in a community where being bereaved was the absolute norm, the absolute dominant experience of being alive, as opposed to the singular one. I learned how they do it from a community-led and community-based model. It was a community where there were 0 paid to be there professionals. And lo and behold, they did okay. And so it really started questioning my idea about colonialism and how that has impacted Western ideas of help and healing and therapy, how much harm that does inherently, how violent that can be, particularly for people from my communities and Michelle's communities. And it was the start of an education. Eventually, I did go back to graduate school. I have a master's in thanatology. Thanatos, as a root word, is the Greek word for death and dying. So thanatology is the study of death and dying and the losses brought about as a result. I worked in hospices all across Southern Ontario for about 10 years, building community-based, volunteer-led bereavement programs. And then in that process of working at one hospice in particular, I met Michelle, and one of the two things, one Michelle already spoke to, but the 2 things I noticed, 10 years into this field and into this career, was that every single professional would say things like grief is normal. They would say grief is not time limited. And then the direct experience of the service and support they were offering said, come to grief counseling, come to grief therapy. And we were like, well, why do we need counseling or therapy if it's normal and nothing's wrong? And it's not time limited, but you can't join our services until it's been 6 months, and you can only join them for 13 months. So all of the parameters of how we offer grief support don't match. They're very incongruent. What we're saying is true, and what we're practicing is deeply divided. And you know, I was hearing people like social workers and people in the field say really horribly judgmental and shitty things about people, you know, like they're keep saying the same thing over and over each time they come in, they're stuck. And you'd be like, do you understand, do you have any grief literacy? Do you understand how storytelling helps to integrate and metabolize grief and loss? Like there was actually no literacy and very little lived experience. And so when I did a little bit of digging, what I found out about Canada in particular, and I know this is true in the US as well, but I'll speak for my own country, is that there isn't a single level graduate course in Canada in nursing, medicine, social work, psychology, psychiatry, or counseling psychology that offers a mandatory 3-credit course in grief and loss. So we have this pathology-based model that says it's normal, but go see a professional. It's normal, but it's so precious, this grief thing, and fragile that you can only be treated by somebody who has a PhD. And then when you go to them, the assumption is that they have some form of training or expertise. Like, I don't want to go get my wisdom teeth taken out by a veterinarian, right? I want to go to the person who has that particular training or kind of expertise. And then the myth in my country, at least, is you go to these people and the truth is that they actually have absolutely no formal training or literacy as part of their education. And so when I met Michelle, one of the areas that we really agreed on was if we truly believe that grief is a normal experience, and I don't like the language of normal, but I would say a human experience, meaning it's no more possible to go through life and not grieve than it is to go through life, and excuse my crassness, but have bowel movements. It's no more possible to go through life without grieving than it is if you get pregnant to go through childbirth. Like they're just mechanisms that the bodies as human beings employ that aren't optional and that occur without our participation and without our consent. And so both Michelle and I decided when we founded Being Here Human that we were not going to operate as a social worker or a counselor any longer. We gave up our designations, and that we were going to operate from the orientation of educators and promote grief literacy with the belief that if we just gave people the accurate information, then we would get about the business of living, not moving on, but just living with our grief because we would understand that it isn't optional. And so we don't need to spend all of our resources on money and time trying to get over it or heal it or make it go away. We just kind of treat it as a chronic condition, if anything else, and just be like, well, this is now my new reality, so what choices do I have within it? So I'd say it was deeply founded, Being Here Human, from this non-pathology model, but meaning that grief is actually a biological imperative for our survival. And then 2, as a North African Middle Eastern woman, as a queer woman, as a woman who lives with disability, Michelle as a woman of color, we were just like, this cannot be, and no offense, I know this is recorded, but this like can't be another Alan Wofelt space or Ken Doka space, you know, we just cannot do like the white man grief lessons anymore. And that it was going to be a grief space that was primarily founded for, created by communities and those who live most on the margins and whose stories were least being centered, at least in the last kind of 20 years of grief theory. And so we did that. We founded it just over 2 years ago, and we didn't know, you know, we thought there would be a hunger for it. We thought there would be a thirst for folks like us to have some space in this community. We hoped, and I think it has for both of us exceeded our wildest expectations. The response, you know, to folks, not just to the non-pathology orientation, but to being able to name in these spaces that not everybody is having the same experience. Just because grief is universal and not optional, absolutely, doesn't mean we're all experiencing the cause of it the same way, the impacts of it the same way. And if we want to really distinguish between grief and mourning, grief is involuntary and non-optional, but mourning is a right. And it is a, you know, I wish it was a human right. It's a luxury. And it's the act of mourning requires 4 things. And it requires time, resources, access, and capacity. And it really needs to be named that those 4 things do not exist equitably for all people. And so that's where we are, and that's who we are. And we're so happy to be here today. So thank you for inviting
Amazing.
us.
Thank you. I have so many responses. I don't even know where to begin, but I'm seeing that the chat bar too is just lively with exuberance and validation, people feeling really validated by everything you guys are saying, which is so good to hear. I guess I want to start with, and you guys in the chat bar, keep putting in questions and comments. We're going to start in on those in about 10, 15 minutes as we continue talking. So you've outlined a lot of things that aren't working, which I completely agree with. I've been doing this work for a long time too. And, you know, one of the things that people say to me more than anything when they come to see me is that they feel like they're doing it wrong. And that's completely, you know, what's being mirrored to them. Like you said, they're getting all these mixed messages about how long they should be grieving, what it should look like, how they should be moving through it. Especially the length of time stuff is always a really big issue. Everyone that comes to see me always talks about they just feel like they're grieving for too long. And I went through this myself. You know, my mom died when I was 18 and my dad 7 years later when I was 25. And there was nothing but kind of white male books about grief out there, and they didn't mirror my experience. And so I just thought that there was something wrong with me and I was crazy and I was doing this wrong and I was, you know, messing up in my grief process. And it took me a long time to kind of figure that out and to heal because of it. So I've been trying to do a fair amount of repair work in that world as well. So what do you guys think the model should be like? And I guess my question is kind of layered. I think, and from what I'm listening to you say as well, it's not just the counselors and the clinical field and world that's causing the problem. It's also cultural. You know, we go around the world and we see how other cultures are more community-based, have different ways of honoring and ritualizing and memorializing and coming together to recognize grief. We're not really very good at that in Western culture. So it's partly cultural and people themselves, but it's also very much the clinical and medical world. Where do we need to start with these changes? And what do you guys think it should look like? What is the ideal model for moving through grief? And
can I take a chunk out of it?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Okay. I just want to check with Misha. Is that cool if I take a first stab?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So this is going to be a bit long-winded, but I want to set it up because sometimes I think the question itself is unintentionally faulty, right? Which is, what should the model be? And what I want to present is the model already exists. It's already within us. There's no way, however you believe we came to be here, whether it's through evolution, creation, whatever your beliefs are, there is no way that if the single guarantee of life, the only two guarantees, is that we're born and we die, it is not possible that we would be born into vessels that are not equipped to metabolize the pain required for both. Right? Which isn't to say we have to like it, and it doesn't mean it's pretty. Like anyone who's done a natural childbirth would say, not a good time, really not a good time. And it doesn't mean our bodies aren't capable of withstanding the pain and the labor that is required to bring life into the world. And we are equipped with the exact same mechanisms to survive the pain and the exhaustion and the labor that occurs when someone's life leaves the world. And so one of the ways that we talk about grief in terms of being a biological imperative is to understand the setup, right? Why do we get to the point, as you said, which is absolutely our experience, where someone says it's been too long, it's too painful, right? So I want to take a step behind that and say, how did that question, what birthed that question? And so there's a lot of what I don't want to assume anyone's gender identity, a lot of what seem to be female-bodied, femme-presenting people on the call. I'm going to assume that some people on the call have delivered and given birth, right?
I've done 3 natural childbirths.
You got it.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
So even for those who haven't, right? If you think, I'm going to just generally rhetorically ask this to everyone on the call. If we think about what have we been taught, right, from the time we were young about what childbirth is. So whether that's stories you heard from family, on the media, seen represented on television, read in stories, if you can think of even before you ever experienced it, what you were taught. And for me, what that looks like was something along the lines of being 11 or 12 years old, and any time I complained in any way about menstrual cramps, the aunties in my life would be like, child, you have no idea. Just wait. Just wait until childbirth. And then when I saw it being shown on TV, people were screaming. There wasn't a single story or image of childbirth I saw that looked like it was a good, gentle, easeful time, right? And so I expected it to be what I had been taught in some form or another, was that it's the most physically painful experience I could experience. And so when I was 42 weeks and I had my first contraction with my daughter, my first thought was, son of a bitch, they were right. Like, nothing about it was a good time, but also nothing about it was surprising, because the experience I was having was mirroring, it was congruent with the experience I had been told my whole life it would be. Now, if we had been told our whole lives and only heard stories and seen in media and read in books the idea that when we were ready to deliver, a flooded, warming sensation would come to us from head to toe, we'd have a gentle sense of euphoria, and then there would be a slight pressure, and out our baby would emerge. And that was every story or depiction of childbirth we ever had, ever. Then what do you think your first thought would be when you actually had your first significant contraction? Any guesses? I can't see the chat, so I don't know if someone's saying it. Our first thought, right, would be something's wrong. Something's wrong. And the immediate response to something's wrong in the body would be terror. Because the experience you are having is not the one everybody told you that it would be. And so I'm hoping that you're seeing the connection to this analogy with grief. Because the problem is in our culture is that from the time we were this big, in every story, in every bit of media, the messaging we've been getting about grief is that it's a time-limited event, that it only occurs when the closest person to you physically dies, and that if you feel your feelings and face it head on, then in 6 to 12 months, it's something that you can get over or recover or heal from, and you move on with your life as though you have never been impacted. That's the story we've been told. And so when we actually have our first experience of significant loss and grief, there is no other response that is possible other than something's wrong, followed by terror. And when we are scared and terrified that something is wrong, we will spend obscene amounts of money and go to unbelievable lengths to try to fix us. But the problem is that there was nothing wrong in the beginning to start out with. We were just set up. We were told that the experience wasn't something that it ever was. And instead, when you say, what model should we have? And this is why literacy to Michelle and I is so important. If from the time we were this big, and in movies and in stories and in every which way, the messaging we got about grief was this: hello, here you are human. And because you are human, at some point in your life, you are going to lose that which you cannot live without. The very thing you believe you need to exist will be severed and taken from you. And it will be the most painful thing you have ever experienced in your life. And you won't know how to breathe, and you won't know how to rise, and you will think that happiness and joy will never be yours again. And when that happens, we will be there, and we will welcome you into the community of the bereaved, and you will be changed. You will never be the same again, but we will walk you through to where a new life is possible. And if that's what we were told, and if that's what was represented, then when you lost, it was your turn, and you lost that which you cannot live without, your first thought would be, son of a bitch, they were right. And there would be no clinician to call, and no one to say, this is too hard, or it's been too long, because that was never the story that they were sold. And so where I believe the model, we have it within us. We don't need to do anything out other than get the hell out of our own ways. What we need to do is to as much as we possibly can in our lifetime, promote literacy, 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 so we can start to change the story that we're telling about grief. So that eventually, I don't think it will happen in my lifetime, but we're actually a part of a culture that says, welcome, this was inevitable. Instead of this was this tragic thing that interfered with my life that I now need to fiercely and kind of obsessively shift so I can go back to who I was before the loss. Does that make sense?
Yes, and you just made everybody cry in such a good way. That was amazing. I feel like I've been waiting my whole life to hear that. And I can't imagine what my experience would have been like losing my mom at 18 if that had been the way it had been set up for me, you know?
Me too.
And it was
Me
exactly
too.
the opposite for me.
Mhm.
And I spent a decade trying to repair it and figure it out and get through it. And if that had been the setup, it would have been wholly different. And it makes me, I have chills everywhere, and it makes me cry to think about. And I know so many people on this call are feeling the same way. Michelle, how do you want to expand on that? Thank you so much, Rochelle. That was phenomenal.
So I would say, so I see a question here. Someone just asked if I could elaborate on how people responded to my grief. And I think it will kind of dovetail off of what Rochelle was talking about. But I think as a person of color, and when we think about grieving in our communities, and especially right now, my grief was met with a lot of fear. My grief looked angry. I was angry that my mother died when she did. I was angry that my children were not going to know their grandmother. So one of the things that we talk about in our trainings is that what we also need in order to grieve the way that we need to grieve is to find our communities. We need to storytell. We need to do that over and over again. We need to be able to internalize the experience that we're having. And as a person of color, that was not something that was immediately available to me. I can only speak about Canada, but I know this is true for folks who live south of the border. But if you're a person of color, if you're a Black or brown person, your grief is not welcome in many spaces, no matter what that looks like. Already there is a discomfort and and sometimes a fear of brown and Black folks by white dominant culture and by many institutions and systems. And so it's very difficult to locate your community. And then the additional piece of being able to storytell becomes almost impossible because no one really wants to hear your story. There's a dismissal of the experience that brown and Black folks have when they experience a loss. Oftentimes, whether the loss is death-related or non-death related, there is a sentiment of that in some way that Black or brown person was responsible for their loss or participated in the precipitation of that loss. So what you find in Black and brown communities is a lot of disenfranchised grief. There's this experience of not being able to openly express that grief or to share the loss because in some way it may be flipped back on them as being responsible for the loss that they experienced. And so I've heard that sentiment within my community. I've had that experience myself.
In what ways do people imagine that you're responsible for your loss?
So let me give you an example. So if we take more current examples, like right now, right? If we think about George Floyd, and if we just think about the ways in which the media has covered the death of George Floyd due to police brutality, the first thing that the media tried to do was tear down George Floyd's character. Immediately, he was criminalized. The activity or whatever it was he was doing was seen to be in some way criminal. And in that way, there's a dismissal of the loss for the family of George Floyd. There's a dismissal of the grief that they may experience, that in some way their loss is not as profound because the person they lost was in some way less worthy of that grief, right? They were less worthy of as a person because we then try to criminalize them in some way. So this happens a lot within Black and Brown communities. And I have to say that it's probably been the experience every single person who's been killed through police brutality, Black person, at some point, their story becomes one of criminality.
Mm-hmm. This is what I was guessing. I just kind of wanted to hear it really spelled out, you know, because I think it's happening so much and still being so overlooked.
Absolutely. So that's a bigger systemic shift that needs to happen in order for people of color, folks who are marginalized, to be able to find their communities, to be able to metabolize their grief, to be able to express their losses in places where it will be heard and accepted and even, I would say, permitted, quite frankly, right? So it's challenging. It's really challenging when you come from marginalized communities. And this is one of the reasons why, for us, it's so very, very important at Being Here Human that although our trainings and our workshops, they're for everyone. We welcome everyone. And that's one of the things we say all the time. All are welcome. All are welcome. We are all human. We are all having these experiences of loss. We are all grieving to varying degrees. All are welcome. And we also want to make sure that we center the voices of marginalized individuals, because they are the ones who are having to grieve within structures and systems that don't give them the space, the permission, I would even say to a certain degree, the sense of safety to be able to grieve and express their losses the way they need to express them. So I think that is something that is ongoing. I think that is something that we as a society, we need to continue to work on as a community, as a larger community. And I'm just looking at the chat.
Mm-hmm. How do we do this though? If we're not changing the model, you know, as you point out, Rochelle, like if it's not the model that needs to be changed, what are we changing? Where do we start and how do we do this? I know there's many ways and we have to be working in many different places, in many different layers of all of this, but what can we be doing as people in the more clinical world, and what can just laymen be doing?
Yeah, I don't think there's any separation, right? I don't. I think
and that's I'm like continuing the problem by even like differentiating those two.
So I think that the clinical world are human beings who've had privilege and access to education. That's the only difference, right? So I think the clinical world, if I'm being super honest and with all due respect, I think they need to like stop getting their egos involved. You don't have the mental health. They keep saying it's a mental health thing. Well, if it's normal, it has nothing to do with mental health. Get out of it. Like, stop being so proprietary over a universal experience, right? And it isn't true. We've just established, because of the way education systems worked, it isn't true that somebody with a PhD in psychology has any more inherent skill, learning, education, specialization in grief and loss than what we would call a layperson. That's not true. And you show me somebody as yourself, forget the clinician part, but who lost both their parents, who was orphaned by 25, that is more experience than any institution can give you to be able to offer solid support. Solid support. And again, I hate to reiterate this, but it's like why we promote literacy is that if we can, you know, think of like, if I think of grief literacy as a public health movement, if you think of when like we asked people originally to stop smoking, people were smoking in airplanes and restaurants, like all over the place. And it took a 25-year in total, with lots of changes within those 25 years, public health campaign to get us to the point now where it would be unheard of to light up in a car with someone, to light up in a restaurant. Like we have we've had a same with seatbelts, bike helmets, right? It takes an actual Forget any clinical model and look at a public health model. And how could we, if we had grief literacy in the part of the education curriculum, 15 years from now, we have a very different culture in relation to grief. It's not even difficult, I would say. We get into our training a little bit, and I don't know that we want to do this because of time today, but I could go into a rant as to why we don't change it and that it's by design. Yeah. Right. There's a reason we know this.
So is it about empowering people then to just, own their grief process more or to feel more comfortable in it? And if so, how?
No. So I would say it's not the reason, because then we're putting the solution on the individual instead of on the system that harms.
Okay.
Right. So the system, very similar to, we know that there are administrations that purposely underfund education, schools and education systems in poor neighborhoods because it promotes the cycle of poverty, right? So we use education as a tool of control, and you don't think of the vastness of the things we study at academic institutions. There is no possible way that if grief is the singular universal experience that we have as human beings, it's not possible that it has just somehow been omitted from curriculum as an oversight. That's not possible. It's absolutely by design. So why? Why and who would want to keep us so illiterate when, as you said, we know it disempowers the bereaved, we know it harms and is violent to us, it doesn't work. So why would we do it? Why then is it still absent? Well, because if we have a pathology-based model, and if we are all grief literate, exactly as your first question on this call was, what do? We go to the ends of the earth to seek healing. And there are tons of individuals. I used to be one. You're one of them. Big Pharma is one of them. There are too many individuals and corporations making so much money off of our illiteracy. If we approach it and say, this is totally normal, let's get literate so that we can all manage this as a community, and we don't need there to be any paid to be their professionals. We don't need any self-help books. We don't need There's no money. If we look at Big Pharma, what are the number 1 and 2 billion-dollar money makers for Big Pharma every year? SSRIs and SNRIs. Well, if you now start giving all of these people who can prescribe those medications a different avenue, and you don't only teach them about major mood disorders and generalized anxiety disorders, and you supplement that education with grief literacy, and you say that the only way to actually distinguish if someone's in a major depressive episode, an anxious episode, or a loss response is by doing a loss history, can you imagine the revenues of loss? So we have to look at it as it's very similar to what we're doing right now in terms of this race reckoning. We have to look at it as a system, and we're not ever going to blame the individuals and say, Black people just need to be more empowered against the police. No, we say the police need to be defunded, right? And so I don't think it's ever on the bereaved person to do it. It's a much larger systemic shift where I think as bereaved people, we can come together and advocate and say, we're done. This isn't cool anymore. This is not cool. We're actually taking the clinical world, we're taking this out of your hands, we're taking it back for us, and we're going to create support and literacy and communities of education for ourselves, by ourselves, because you, with all of your good intentions, have actually not done anything but harm.
That makes sense. It's still hard to, it just feels really overwhelming.
It's so overwhelming. It really is. But this is the amazing thing, right? So I would say on each of our trainings, we do a few a month, say we have about 30 to 40 people on a call, right? And in 2 hours, which is not a lot of time, from their homes over Zoom, this isn't involving big travel or big conference money or anything like this. In a 2-hour conversation, folks are given just we call it a palate cleanser, a little bit of information, just a little bit of what I'm saying on the call today. And you see everyone go, oh, because the truth is nothing that Michelle and I are saying is actually revolutionary. It's just the naming of the deepest knowing we've all had. It's just putting some language to it. And so when, in my experience, when I moved away from kind of supportive counseling and into educating, then folks would hear it. They would feel empowered because of the information they were given. They had some language for it. And then I don't see people, even if people want to work with me one-on-one, it's like 6 sessions, maybe. And it's just to get some language. And then what happens, which is so beautiful, is we just, in the same way that we don't, if we are having some digestive issues as an example, right? And you don't know what to do, you might for a little while like do an elimination diet, see what happens if you take out dairy, see what happens if you take out gluten, maybe not do certain fruits for a bit, and you learn yourself. You learn about what actually supports feeling well in your body, but you know how to do it. And that's the same with literacy. You just get a little information, and then you have room within the reality of your circumstances to have some agency of how you want to live with it or move through it. It sounds kind of, I don't mean to make it to be reductionist about it, but it's like I'm lactose intolerant. I can choose to participate in ice cream and bear the consequences, or I can choose not to. And I make a different choice based on the day and if I have lactate pills, right? But it's like the lactose intolerance isn't going away.
Yeah.
And so if I actually just understand it and I'm not completely overcome with thinking that I can reverse lactose intolerant, or that it's the lactose intolerance is a reflection of my weakness of character, or that I can, spending all this energy trying to change something that it is not changeable. And instead I just make a decision of whether I want ice cream or not. It's going to be a different kind of life. And that's what I've seen with people with literacy, is that once they have language of information and they stop spending all of their life energy trying to shift that which cannot be shifted, they then open up an entirely different realm of agency.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Do you guys want to answer some of the questions in the chat? We only have about a little less than 15 minutes, and there's so many amazing big questions in there. I know that Michelle's been trying to answer some, but do you want to hit some there anyway?
Sure. So one of the ones I was just answering was the idea of like, if we normalize grief, if we all accept the idea that grief is normal, then what does support look like for the grieving individual or the bereaved individual? And so they were asking, what would we do? What do they do in Ghana? And I mean, Rochelle can explain what they do in Ghana, but the first thing that I would say is that we don't want to appropriate anyone else's culture or ceremonial practices or anything like that and then try to apply it to our Western experiences over here. So I think what's really important to think about is that grief can look different for different people. It doesn't look the same for everyone. And if we all accept the idea that grief is normal, then we also have to accept that each and every single person's grief expression is going to look different, and that is normal for them. And if we can accept that, then we don't need to be afraid when we see an individual whose grief expression falls outside of what we would consider to be socially sanctioned or socially acceptable expressions of grief. And what I mean by that is that in those moments when, for example, we have these ideas about how long grief should last, right? So grief should only be, 6 months, and then you should be over it. We have in the corporate world, we have 3 days of bereavement leave. You're meant to go away for 3 days, grieve, and come back to work and be unaffected. If we remove these constraints, these socially prescribed constraints to what grief looks like and what grief expression looks like, then we start to allow space for all kinds of expressions of grief. We start to normalize all kinds of expressions of grief. And in that way, we can actually allow folks to feel accepted in their expression, and not to be made to feel as though there's something wrong with how they're choosing or how their bodies are expressing. This is one of the things we talk about, is that grief itself is involuntary. We don't participate in how our bodies are going to express grief. We don't get to choose what that looks like. It's an entirely involuntary process, right? How we mourn is something that we can choose what that will look like. But how our bodies are going to grieve is not a voluntary process, right? When we start to understand that this is involuntary, then the person who is having trouble sleeping for 6 months, and then the other person who's actually hyper vigilant about everything, who's having massive amounts of anxiety, we start to understand that these are just involuntary ways that these individuals are grieving. They can't control that. And in that way, we can actually start to support them from that perspective, where we can allow the individual to have their grief expression without pathologizing it, without making them feel in any way that their expression is right or wrong. Part of the underlying issue for us as a culture is that we have an aversion to loss, and by default then have an aversion to interacting with bereaved individuals or to confronting another person's grief experience or grief response. I don't know if you wanted to add anything more to that, Rochelle.
I don't know. I can't not see it. My brain goes so macro, so I can't not see it from a systemic issue. Like some of the questions, I'm just like, oh, those are colonized questions, right? Or, oh, those questions come from the underlying assumption that there is a binary, or that it's healed or not healed, or it's healthy or not healthy. And that's not how I orient myself to grief. It's why we're called Being Here Human, because I actually just believe that it's a human experience. And I think perfectionism in some ways of trying to master something is a pillar of white supremacy. And so I'm personally not interested in participating or perpetuating my own oppression. And as such, it's not the orientation that I come from it with. I think that we are capable and built to live with profoundly hard and unresolvable things. And the idea that if you throw the right education, counselor, clinician, or money at something, that it will shift that which is unresolvable, to me is whiteness and peak colonialism. And so I just live in this space, and the work that we do is from the space that most things in life are not resolvable. Most things are random. Most things are hard and have hardship involved. And that doesn't mean I don't want to be here and I don't want to deeply live. And so I want to hold both those things and all those things, and not in any way treat myself as someone who, because 15 years later and almost 40 years later, I am still grieving, I am still longing, I am still anxious, I am still hopeful, and at other times cynical, that anything at all is wrong with me or needs shifting or changing. That it's actually just the most inevitable outcome from being here human.
There's just so much. Are there any other questions? I don't want to take up, if there are other questions are you seeing anything in there, Michelle, that you wanted to address?
I'm just seeing a lot of really great comments.
Enthusiastic,
Yeah.
Here's one that
Sheila says, how do we support people we know who are grieving? So this is one other thing I do want to say, actually, that we miss in grief support. We miss the foundation of consent, right? How do we support somebody? Ask them. Ask. And it's not because bereaved people will always know what they need, but you can just ask, right? I was thinking of ordering you guys dinner in tonight. Would that be welcomed? Yes or no? I noticed that your lawn needs mowing. Would it be okay if I came over and did that? Yes or no? I feel like you're a little bit distant and might need some space. Is that true? Or would you like me to come by and perhaps we can read next to each other? Right? Again, the perfectionism, even the question, how do we support people? We want to get it right. Right? We just want all the answers. We want to do it right. We don't want to make mistakes. And that is whiteness. Right? That is our colonial history. And as opposed to just ask. And you might get it wrong, and it's totally cool. Ask again, show up again. Because I could give you a list of how you could support me. I could tell you that, but I couldn't tell you. I do know Michelle well, so I probably could guess, but right, I don't want to speak for Michelle. I don't want to speak for Claire or Dara. I don't know. So just ask. And I find there's so much prescription in grief support and grief theory that we're not laying down a very, very foundational layer of consent that just says to me, there is no possible way you can ever know what someone needs or should do better than they do. You can't. And so you can show up and you can ask and be prepared to be wrong and show up again. But if this is about doing it right or trying to be good, that's just whiteness dressed up in a different outfit.
When you guys look back on your personal experiences of grief at this point from where you are now in your work and in your life, what would you do differently, if anything?
Oh my God.
You know, I'll tell you why I'm struggling. Because even now, today, I mean, my significant loss was over 10 years ago. And I would say even today, the resources and or the spaces for me to grieve the way that I need to, or the way that my body needs to, and my grief expression, those resources and spaces still don't exist, is the truth, right? So I don't know that I could say what I would like it to look like, but I don't know that I could say that there would be something I would do differently, because I did what I could at the time. And even now, I would say if I experienced another significant loss today, I don't know that, well, I know that I have Rochelle and I have a community now that I've built through being here human, but like outside of that, I can't say that very much has changed for me as a person of color.
There was nowhere for me to go at 18. There was, I hit a wall everywhere I turned, and everyone said, you're fine. You're 18, you're in college, move on, get over it. You'll be fine. There were no resources. There was nothing like the work you guys are doing. There was not the Reimagine community. There weren't even a lot of the books that are out there, or memoirs even, or anything that have been helpful to me now.
Yeah, when I think about it, it's like I wish Megan's book existed back then for me. I think if that was the first thing that was put in my hands, I would have had a really different experience. For those who don't know, Megan Devine wrote It's Okay to Not Be Okay. I think if that was the first thing that touched my hands, it would have really been different. I was really lucky. I went to a bereavement support group in my city in Toronto through an agency called Wellspring, and it was only for people who had lost their lives to cancer. And I, as you can imagine, at 25 was the youngest one in the group by about 35 years. But I just happened to have the experience where all of these much, much older than me, white men and women and who had their 50s and 60s just kind of scooped me up. We're still in touch to this day. So I was really lucky in that regard to just have that experience. What I will say in relationship to my grief today, something I just wrote about this, actually, we're in the middle of a grief writing workshop right now, that is very complicated for me. And there's nothing to do about it or resolve, it's just complicated, is that for so much of my life, like I would say the first even like 10 years after she died, I had this work and I had a life that was meaningful, but I would always say, and it was true for me, I would say I would give every single bit of this up for 5 minutes with her, and it was true. I would have just given all of it up. And then what's happened to me in recent years, which is complicated, is I'm married now, I have 2 kids, I have work that I deeply love and find meaningful. And the truth is not that anyone's offering it, but if you said to me right now, would you give it all up for her to come back? The answer now, if I'm being super honest, is no, I wouldn't. And it is very complicated, I would just say, for me to be in a life again where I once again feel like I have so much to lose. Because for so long after she died, I just felt like reckless and invisible and was just like, try me.
Yeah.
And so to be 15 years later in a life where I actually do feel like I have a lot to lose, and then to be in a life where every single thing that I have of deep value to me came from her death, is just a complicated reality to live with.
You guys, this has been amazing. I feel like we could talk for hours more, and I'm kind of freaked out that we have to get off now. You guys are going to be coming up soon on the Reimagine Festival, right? People can find you there for more. When is that, Dara? You put it in the chat just now. And then where can people find you guys, and how do they? Instagram or your website? Like where can you be found for more?
Yes, Instagram, you can find us at Being Here Human, Facebook Being Here Human, website www.beingherehuman.com. And then Mish, would you want to tell the dates for this festival that's coming up? Because I'm not sure I remember.
Oh yeah, so we are on Reimagine. We're doing a part 1 of a grief literacy training on July 16th, and that is from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern.
Yeah, amazing.
And
so
I just put the link in the chat too, so
fantastic.
I can do it again, as well as your website.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dara.
No, thank you.
Thank you guys so much. This has been incredible, and I feel like we barely scraped the surface. So we might have to have you back again in a couple of weeks. We'll see.
So happy.
Yeah. Next week, Suki Forbes is going to be joining me to talk about her experience with child loss and just kind of looking into that realm. And Dara, I'll let you close us out, but thank you all so much for being here with us today. Again, this is really my favorite time of the week to have these discussions and just hear so many different voices and ideas and kind of expand our minds and hold space for all this grief. Thank you guys so much, Michelle and Rochelle.
Thank you.
And I'll see you everybody next week. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Claire.
Yeah, thank you.
No, and I'll just say on a personal front, it was like throughout the talk, I was like, yeah, like, so anyways, yeah, it was very like energizing and validating and all the things. So thank you for that. And so obviously I have a feeling that a lot of people on this call are going to sign up for your workshop. If that was just a dose of like what more is to come. I also wanted to mention, I put 2 other links to events that we have coming up. Dose of Togetherness with Peggy McGuire, who runs the Cambia Health Foundation, and she's going to be talking about the inequities that were exposed through COVID. And she's just a really wonderful person, and is going to be sharing some really important information. And then we also have a vigil coming up on the 9th with Leon Ford, who was paralyzed at the hands of the police, and talking about his work with the police since then. And also BJ Miller, a palliative care doctor, and he's going to be speaking, as well as Pastor Corey Kennard, who was on with Claire about a month ago. So I don't know, it should be a really beautiful evening. And I hope you all can join us again next week. But thank you for making this so special.
Thanks, everybody. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Oh, yeah. You can turn off your, or turn on your mic if you want. It's always kind of nice to hear a chorus of goodbyes and thank yous. So.
Goodbye. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
And I forgot to call out that we had somebody from France and Amsterdam too, and probably other countries. So it always makes it exciting.
They're a great group.
Thanks, everybody.
Right.